I want to welcome you to Lecture 7. We're going to be looking at the historical and development approach to the Old Testament canon. Now, the English word canon comes to us through the Latin, which is borrowed from the Greek, canon, who ultimately gains it from the Hebrew word kana. The root meaning is reed, and then provides a number of derivative senses. The first is a reed might be used as a measuring rod, kind of like a foot stick or yardstick. And so it comes to mean a standard or rule in a metaphorical sense. Origen, an early Greek church father, used the word to denote the rule of faith, which meant the standard by which we are to measure and evaluate everything offered to us that we're supposed to believe. A third sense is a list or index. Now, this may be derived from a series of marks on the measuring rod, maybe the idea behind the expression the canon of Scripture. The canon of Scripture is a list of books recognized as Holy Scripture and as authoritative. Okay, that's the key word. They are recognized as authoritative for belief and conduct. So is there any distinction between canon and authority? Well, canon or canonicity is always dependent upon authority. The scriptures placed in the canon are there, listen to this, because they already possessed an authority that was recognized by the believing the community. They are included in the list because they possessed an authority before being put in the list. The church didn't say these things have authority, but they recognized the authority that they already possessed. Two biblical illustrations. When he came down from Mount Sinai in Exodus 24:7, the people acknowledged what they heard from Moses' lips are the very words of God. They understood what he said as authoritative and binding upon their lives. Paul writes to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 14:37, and apparently the church understood his words as having authority and were binding upon them as well. So the history behind the Old Testament canon, Luke 24:44, is a story about Jesus and his disciples in the upper room. And Jesus' words implies that he understands the Old Testament to have authority. Use the idea that he had fulfilled the scriptures from three areas in the Old Testament: the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. Here, the Psalms are used because it was the largest of all the writings. The threefold body of Old Testament writings, Jesus considered these not only divinely inspired, but also canonical. That is, they were authoritative writings that had been gathered together into one collection so that the writings within the body were canonical and those outside are not canonical. Now, something to consider, Bruce on page 97 of his book, Books on the Parchment, says, it can be taken for granted that by this time the first two sections, the law and the prophets, contained all the books which they contain in the Hebrew Bible that we know. He continues, but did the third section, the writings, contain all the books which it now contains? Well, probably so. So Bruce says. Now, his support for his assumption, he quotes Jesus' statement in Luke 11:51, which has a parallel in Matthew 23:35. Here, Jesus summarizes all the martyrs whose blood had been shed in the Old Testament times and used the expression from the blood of Abel until the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary. His explanation for the assumption, obviously Abel's the first martyr of the Bible, but why should Zechariah come last? The order of books in the Hebrew Bible has 2 Chronicles as the last book. Therefore, 2 Chronicles 24:21 makes Zechariah the last martyr. And we read how he was stoned when he prophesied to the people in the court of the house of the Lord. So why the question about all the writings? The debates among the rabbis after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, they met at Jebna between Joppa and Azotus or Ashdod. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai obtained permission from the Romans to reconstruct the Sanhedrin on a purely spiritual matter. Some of their discussions were handed down by oral tradition. And so here you can see where Jamni is located there, kind of along the coastal plain. The tradition reports that they debated whether canonical status should be given to the books of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Esther. The objections to these books, Esther's question, because there's a lack of God's name in it. You won't find God's name used. Ecclesiastes is hard to square with contemporary orthodoxy of that day and time in AD 70. The resolution of Jamnia that these 4 books belonged to the Old Testament canon. There were some other books, like the Wisdom of Jesus, the son of Ben Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus, and the Gilionim, the Aramaic gospel writings, were denied a place in the Old Testament canon. What about the decision of Jamnia? This is not to be overrated. They did not decide which one belonged, but they simply confirmed public opinion of these books. They neither added to the list nor took anything away from it. Ezekiel was one of the most hotly debated of the books considered. His place had been settled among the second group long before this meeting in Jamnia, but the chariot vision gave rise to the mystical interpretations, and chapters 40 through 48 proved hard to reconcile the prescriptions for worship of those in the Pentateuch. Other data to support the canonization process of the Old Testament: Philo, a learned Jew from Alexandria; Josephus, a Jew during the destruction of Jerusalem; Melito, bishop of Sardis, about AD 170, the library of the Greek Patriarch in Jerusalem manuscript; Origen, a Greek Bible scholar from 185 to 254; Athanasius, bishop of Alexandria, AD 367; and Jerome, a Latin biblical scholar, AD 347 to 420. So Philo's contribution: he lived about 20 years on either side of Jesus. He seems to know and accept the Hebrew canon. The law, without question, was inspired from Philo. Philo acknowledged the authority of the other Hebrew canon books. He used only the Septuagint version, though, of the Old Testament. The Old Testament apocryphal books are not authoritative to him, and so we're not for sure about his attitude toward the writings, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, because Philo just doesn't mention them. Josephus is more precise about relating which books the nation of Israel considered authoritative. He identifies that they used only 22 books, but it's helpful to remember that there's a number of 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. He says that all are believed to be divine. He explains that the current belief was that inspiration ceased with the prophets soon after the return from the exile. So Josephus is 22 and our 39. Well, the Pentateuch has 5 books, 13 books of the prophets, reduced to 8 by Josephus. So you have Daniel, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are one more book. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Job may have been one book. Final 4 would have been Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. So he probably reckoned Ruth with Judges and Lamentations with Jeremiah. Melito is the earliest datable Christian list of Old Testament books. He was bishop of Sardis about AD 170. And his information was said to have been gained while in Syria, and Eusebius records it for us in his 4th book of his ecclesiastical history. His list: he writes to a friend, Onesimus, and says the list is as follows: 5 books of Moses, that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Jesus Noah, Judges, Ruth. 4 books of Kingdoms, 2 of Chronicles, the Psalms of David, Solomon's Proverbs, also called Wisdom, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and Job. And the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, the 12 in a single book, Daniel, Ezekiel, and Ezra. So other considerations about Melito's list is likely that he included Lamentations and Jeremiah with Nehemiah and Ezra. If that's the case, and we find 38 of the Hebrew books in his list. Esther is missing, And again, it may be because Esther was not included in the list that he received from Syria. His list follows the Septuagint order as well. The list of the Greek Patriarchate in Jerusalem dates to about the same time as Melito's list. It was reproduced in a treatise by the late 4th century writer Epiphanius, who was bishop of Salamis in Cyprus. In this list, each name of the Old Testament books are given twice, first in Hebrew Aramaic and then transcribed into Greek characters, and then in the Greek Septuagint form. This list gives a total of 27 books, but the 27 correspond to our 39, except the Lamentations is not included by name. This may be included as an appendage to Jeremiah's work. Origen's contributions. The greatest Greek biblical scholar among the church fathers, around 185 to 254, gives a list of canonical books. Gives a list of 22 books that he enumerates and names them in Hebrew as well as with their Greek titles. His list, you got the 5 books of Moses, followed by Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, reckoned as one among the Jews. And the 4 books of the kingdoms, which among them he counts as one book, Samuel, and another, our 1st and 2nd Kings, which they call after its opening words, and King David. More of his list, you have Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah as one, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah with Lamentations, the Epistle of Jeremiah reckoned as one, Daniel, Ezekiel, Job, and Esther. 12 prophets are left off the list by accident, apparently. Athanasius' contributions, he discussed the canon of the Old Testament in his Easter letter for AD 367. He listed the 22 books that make up our 39 books. Yet again, Esther is omitted. Lamentations is added to Jeremiah along with Baruch. He added that other books were not canonical, but the fathers handed down as good to read for new converts: Wisdom of Solomon, the Wisdom of Sirach, Esther, Judah, and Tobit. Jerome's contribution, perhaps the greatest Bible scholar among the Latin fathers, lived around 347 to 420. In his preface to his commentary on Daniel, he says, I point out that Daniel's not reckoned among the prophets by the Hebrews, but among those who wrote the Hagiographa, or the sacred writings. His quote continues, as a matter of fact, they divide all scripture into 3 parts, the law, the prophets, and the Hagiographa, consisting of 5, 8, and 11 books respectively. In his prologue to the books of Samuel and Kings, Jerome notes that often the number was reduced to 22 to respond to the number of letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So his list of 22 explains the Jews counted Ruth with Judges, Lamentation with Jeremiah, while others raised the number to 27. This allowed for the 5 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, which had 2 forms, thus dividing Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations into 2 books each. So is there evidence for a threefold Old Testament canon? Some scholars think so, but others deny it. E.J. Young says that there's just not enough evidence to demonstrate the theory. So what about the Old Testament canon of Christians today? The fact that our Lord and the early apostles accepted the Old Testament canon as complete ought to be enough for us. Jesus found enough authority in them to quote from them and to accept them as binding on his mission on earth. So the question is, can we do any better? Yes, Jesus often criticized the Jewish leaders on their traditions, but never on the respect for the authority and canonicity of the scriptures. What was indispensable to the Redeemer ought to be indispensable to the redeemed.
Now look at here.
That's it.